Well, it's my pleasure to welcome JR Nyquist, who's just written a new blog called The Path to War and Assessment. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Okay, I have to say your content is quite disturbing and but important. So let me share with our audience few paragraphs from your new column. According to the GRU defector Stanislav Lunev, Russia and China were engaged in secret talks at the end of the Cold War. Their plan was to organize the destruction of the United States as a world power under cover of the, quote, collapse of communism and Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations. Moscow had high hopes for this plan. The communist movement they knew was not merely a Soviet thing. The crazy beliefs of the communist-inspired left would no longer be associated with Moscow and its intelligence networks. Instead, the CIA would be blamed for everything. America would also be blamed, from international drug trafficking and terrorism to pandemics and climate change. A constant disinformation campaign, a continual bombardment of factual distortion and outright lies would convince Americans that their own defensive structures were evil. Okay, so from what you're saying, I guess let's break this down. The collapse of communism that most people think took place in 1991, roughly. That did not happen. Okay.
Well, from 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, all the way to 91 with the August coup and the breakup of the Soviet Union, those things happened, but it didn't represent the end of communism. It didn't represent the collapse of communism, and here's why. We had three defectors who said they were planning to fake the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. They were going to fake the collapse of communism. They were going to bring down the Berlin Wall on purpose. In 1984, the KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn wrote in the book 148 or 9 falsifiable predictions. They were going to get rid of the Communist Party as the ruling party of Russia. They were going to disassemble the Warsaw Pact. They were going to release prisoners from the Gulag. There were, of those predictions, 148 or 9 predictions. By 1994, almost 94% of the predictions had come true. Now, either he was a psychic or he was channeling his understanding of Soviet intelligence and grand strategy when he was in think tanks in the late 1950s that were planning some of these moves decades in advance. And Zaslav Bittman also knew it was fraudulent, said he knew about it. Jan Shena, in his book We Will Bury You, written in 1982, he said they were planning to fake the collapse of the Warsaw Pact alliance, the communist alliance. So we have multiple defector testimonies that communism was planning a false liberalization. And was it false? Yeah, of course. Because Boris Yeltsin, at the end of his term as president, asked Bill Clinton at their meeting in Istanbul, and it's in the Clinton archives, you can go and look it up. He said to Bill Clinton, "All I want from you, Bill, is give Europe to Russia." That was in late 1999. Boris Yeltsin is asking Clinton to hand Europe over to Russia. So the fact that Clinton said, well, I can't do that, and Boris Yeltsin said, all right, well, there's this new guy coming. His name is Vladimir Putin. And what does Vladimir Putin do? He's organized the armies and the nukes, and he's moving west with artillery bombardments and airstrikes and missile strikes, and he's threatening the West with nuclear war, and he's aligned with China, which was one of Golitsyn's predictions that the Sino-Soviet split was false, and that at the end of the long-range strategy, the deception, Russia and China would form one clenched fist, upset the balance of power, and come after the West. And this is exactly what we are seeing. All of Golitsyn's, not just 94% of them, now we're seeing 98% of them coming true. This is what we're seeing.
Okay, all right. So All right. All right. In your the rest in rest of your essay, you continue to describe a strategy of what a demoralization of the West. Explain. I mean, explain that. I think most Americans, they can understand weapons, they can understand physical threats, but this idea of demoralization, propaganda, manipulation, it I think most Americans have no sense of how that would work.
Well, they don't really understand physical threats because most Americans think nuclear weapons aren't a real threat because if you launch three of them, the world ends from radiation. That just isn't true. So they put out movies like On the Beach back in the early 60s that convinced people that nuclear war is the end of the world. No reason to think about it anymore. So when the Cold War ended, we just let our nuclear weapons industries collapse. We just got rid of our tritium plants. We got rid of our nuclear weapons factories. We're
Mhm.
trying to rebuild them. You know, to build the defensive infrastructure in the Cold War that was mutual assured destruction, that was our defense, it costs us 7 trillion in today's money. We have only committed to spending 1.2 trillion on our strategic defense today. So we made ourselves safe for more than a generation with a 7 trillion dollar investment. We're not willing to do that now. We're not willing to defend. We won't commit the money. Europe won't commit the money. You've got Trump saying, I'm not going to defend you if you don't spend more, because what's the point? Nobody wants to spend on defense except the Chinese and the Russians. They're
Mhm.
spending huge, not just 2% of GDP or 3% of GDP like the Western countries. They're spending 17 to 25% of their GDP on weapons. And China is practically dislocating its own economy to build up its military economy. They're building factories, weapons factories are sprouting up out of the ground like weeds.
Okay, all right. Let me read from part of your text here, and I'm sure you'll have a comment. Since China will be the primary invading power in a 21st century war, and China has unlimited reserves of manpower, the scorched earth strategy has been ruled out because it would tend to hinder conquest. Note, partisan. Actually, let me just share the text so people can read with me. Hold on. Okay. Partisans are not a problem if you have large reserves of well-equipped troops to defeat them. Also, biological weapons are favored by China in future operations against America. How do we know China intends to invade the United States? Over the last decade, China has been infiltrating millions of Chinese into Canada, Mexico, and directly into the US. It seems that People's Liberation Army strategists envision a continent-wide ground war in North America involving Chinese ground forces. In this scenario, triggering a civil war within the United States becomes a major objective. To make all this work, China must use a surprise attack with nuclear weapons to destroy all American naval and nuclear forces. All right, so the of course, most Americans would say, well, if they tried to attack us with nuclear weapons, we would reciprocate. So, explain to us how this works out.
I I was in Toronto at the conference on the Arctic in September that the Mackenzie Institute put on at the Albany Club, and I had dinner with General Glenn Van Herk and his deputy General Peltier and other Canadian high-ranking military officers. Uh, General Van Herk was the commander of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, commander of NORTHCOM as well, four-star American general. And he told me that the Russians had developed first strike weapons, the which is of course the hypersonic missile that goes way up and then comes down and can maneuver and can't be intercepted. Once it goes down low, it can't be intercepted. And of course the extra long range Russian nuclear warhead carrying cruise missiles that can be launched by Russia's super quiet submarines. They keep 5 of these submarines off the East Coast and they keep 4 off the West Coast. These are first strike weapons. You can hardly track them or detect them. They could launch a surprise attack and basically take out our infrastructure. The Chinese now, according to Mr. Wang of Luda Media, the Chinese are developing a heavy drone. This is a drone that weighs more than a ton. It can carry micronuclear weapons. It is controlled by an AI. It's got its own brain that it can maneuver. It doesn't need a pilot. It's a kamikaze drone. They can smuggle these drones into the United States by the thousand disguised as farm equipment. See, farm equipment comes in pieces, and these drones would come in pieces looking like farm equipment. They would get to farmland or they would get to warehouses owned by Chinese companies on American soil. They would make a little takeoff strip. They would put these drones together, put the micronuclear warheads in them, and they are designed to attack our nuclear missile silos, of which there are only about 450. They smuggled 450 of these drones in our country. They can wipe out our entire land-based missile force. They can destroy the planes that carry the signals to the submarines for our submarines to launch the nuclear missiles. And of course, the bombers are easy to wipe out on the ground because our strategic bombers are not loaded with nuclear weapons. They're not kept in the air. They would take several hours to load to get the pilots to them. So it's easy. You launch a first strike, you take out the bombers, you take out the land-based missiles, you cut off the communication, the permissive action codes from the submarines. Submarine commander can't launch a nuke. A boomer commander cannot launch a nuke without the code sent to him. If they destroy the code, the equipment that sends the codes to the submarines can't launch. So they can get a first strike in where they don't get any attacks. Now, what if they make a mistake and a few missiles get through? China can absorb many nuclear strikes and win a war. So can Russia. So huge countries. But the United States, if we lose all of our nuclear weapons at a first strike, guess what? How do we defend? When Russia and China are sitting on reserves of nuclear weapons and can say, Chicago, you're going to surrender or you're going to be nuked. Los Angeles, you're going to be surrendered or be nuked. Or just go make an example out of San Francisco or Seattle. Make an example of a few cities and watch how quickly they surrender. Japan in 1945, we took out 2 Japanese cities. Out of 67 Japanese cities, we took out 2 and the whole country surrendered. We nuked 2. And the Japanese before that were determined to fight to the death. And those were only atomic bombs. Those weren't hydrogen bombs. And by the way, hydrogen bombs are a lot cleaner than dirty fission bombs. Hydrogen bombs are fusion bombs, and you don't poison the atmosphere. You don't create if you airburst them, you wake up the next morning, it's just a clear sky and nice fresh air. There's not a problem. So you got to understand, nuclear war is very possible, and that's what they're thinking. And by the way, China's going to have these same kind of weapons as Russia has now in 4 or 5 years, according to General Van Herk. And what do we have? In the next 4 or 5 years, we're not going to be able to strengthen our defenses because we have to rebuild the infrastructure first to strengthen our defenses, which is going to take us 4 or 5 years.
Okay, I mean, I was thinking that, look, we all know that Biden is bless you. Biden is virtually senile, I guess, and Donald Trump is the one that I would imagine they take more seriously. But from what you're saying, even a more serious president is handicapped because of decades of lack of preparation.
Right, because it takes years to prepare to build the weapons and to train the people. You have to train the welders and the electricians and all the people that know how to make a warship, an ICBM, a warhead. This takes time. We let all that go. We let the training go. We let the programs go. And, I said to General Van Herk, well, the Russians and Chinese are ahead. They could take us out now if they're together. And General Peltier, Lieutenant General Canadian Deputy Head of NORAD, said, why would they do that when in 4 years they'll be stronger? What do you mean they're going to be stronger? Because they're going to continue to widen the gap in strength over the next 4 years because we have to go back to the drawing board and build our infrastructure. We're not going to be able to build nukes till 2029, right? I mean, we've refurbished some of our nukes, but what does that mean? That means we've actually, by to refurbish them, we've made them less potent to make it so they will detonate, right? To make it so they'll work. So our bombs are not as powerful. We were bragging that we have this little dial on our bombs and we can dial them down. That's not nothing to brag about, that you can make your nuclear warheads weaker, you know? But people don't read the fine print. They don't understand the kind of smoke and mirrors that's being put out. We have avoided having to make a commitment to strategic offense and defense all this time. Did you know what Van Herk told me, that the North American Air Defense Command, that used to have 1,000 fighter planes to defend Canada and the U.S., has only 24 fighters to defend it now?
Okay.
Right? Does that sound good to you? 40 launchers to shoot down a Russian or Chinese ICBM. Of course, they don't have anything really that can shoot down one of these cruise missiles or one of these, um, hypersonic missiles that can maneuver in flight. They can't even tell where the target is. He said, well, I could send a fighter plane after a cruise missile, but it'd be a long shot to shoot down a cruise missile with a fighter. So this is what we're up against.
Okay, let me share one more paragraph from your essay. How do we explain the West's failure to match Soviet and Chinese war preparations? The fundamental difference between the strategists in Washington and the strategists in Moscow follows from differences in their basic assumptions. In Washington, a nuclear world war is thought to be a near impossibility. In Moscow, on the contrary, world nuclear war is more than theoretically possible. It is, as Sokolovsky's text explained, a fundamental type of war in the present epoch.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I noticed that you have a discussion about Alexander Dugin, who appeared on Tucker Carlson's show. Dugin has publicly stated the American empire should be destroyed. When Dugin pretends to embrace classical or traditional thinking sprinkled with spiritual transcendence, he nonetheless steers straight for the end times and the final war of the world island. Okay,
That's World War III, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, well, all right. Well, you point out at the end of your blog that about Trump and Putin are planning to meet, I guess, sometime in 2025.
In
Look,
March, I think they're planning.
Okay, so what is that meeting about, and what if anything do you envision being accomplished? I mean, look, every sane person on the face of the earth, at least from my perspective, we want to live in peace. We want to have mutually beneficial relationships. I mean,
That sounds like a snowflake talking there.
I'm just saying that. Okay.
We all want to hug and sing Kumbaya. No, the idea that the Russians, look, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, who I knew personally,
Okay.
said that he had spent his 31 years in the Soviet and Russian military practicing for one kind of war only, a nuclear world war against America. And the thing is that if I can nuke a bunch of cities and kill a couple hundred, 400 million people at the most, and I can own the world, why isn't that a good deal for me? Please explain.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, okay.
If I'm a hair trigger psychopath like Stalin or Hitler, why am I going to bat an eye at that?
Okay. All right. There's another part of your essay where you get into the psychopathic mind, which I think we need to discuss that because most people most average people in the I would imagine around the world can't even relate to this type of mind. So let me read this to our audience and bring us up to speed here. 1 second. All right, here we go. The communist complex of lies and warfare form a complete whole. First, incapacitate the enemy's mind, disconnect him from the truth, disorient him politically and spiritually. The secret of victory at the psychological level is not the false narratives in and of themselves. It's the obliteration of truth in the victim's mind that is decisive. A mind cut off from truth is alienated, disorganized. Such a mind is already demoralized. At the first nuclear blow, a disoriented mind will collapse into despair. He will not rally to defend. What has to happen for communist victory is simple. People must be demoralized ahead of time. Tell them that nuclear weapons signify the end of the world, the end of all life on Earth. Invent false scenarios like nuclear winter. This kind of disinformation has not only encouraged nuclear disarmament in Western countries, in the future, it will allow Russian and Chinese troops to advance into America's bombed landscape without suffering heavy casualties. The defenders, in total despair that the end of the world has come, will have no reason to resist. Christians will expect the return of Christ and forget their duty to resist the enemy. So, okay, so you're envisioning a nuclear attack followed by a land invasion, and I guess you're saying that the Chinese have already, you said, have millions of soldiers in China, Mexico, and America. Is that
Millions of people.
millions of people?
The
Okay.
number of those people that are People's Liberation Army reservists is unknown, but I would guess that it's a fairly large number.
Okay, well, we know that our southern border has been open for the past 4 years, and estimated, 15 million people roughly have come in. And I have seen reports of Chinese young male, healthy looking Chinese coming over the southern border with
And
no.
there's many Chinese in Mexico. Mexico's crawling with Chinese.
Okay. All
They
right.
don't have to cross but there's a highway in Baja that the Chinese had Mexican contractors build going up from Ensenada up to Tijuana and San Diego. And the Mexican contractors were told by the Chinese that this was the Chinese invasion highway into the United States. Chinese would offload their troops in Ensenada and they would march up that highway. They would drive up that highway into San Diego from there.
Okay. Is there anybody in the U.S. Defense Department who is concerned about these
Oh
issues?
yeah, there are. Mm-hmm. Yep, there
Okay.
are.
All right. And I would imagine that the ones who are concerned were not dominant during the last 4 years. Is that correct?
Uh, I don't think at the top level, I don't think the Secretary of Defense
Right.
was concerned about it. I really don't. I think that there is in the Democratic Party near the top, it is a Marxist or Marxist-Leninist cadre that has infiltrated and taken over the Democratic Party. Not everybody in the Democratic Party, not everybody in the leadership is a communist, but there's a lot of communists in it. And
Right.
they've got a level of control in the Democratic Party that I think is frightening. And I think they have a lot of leverage on the administration. I think the biggest problem that the Communist bloc has had with their American politician friends, the friends that are most sympathetic to the Soviet Union and China, is that these friends have been so corrupted by the because the Russians want them to be corrupt and want them to be have some kind of leverage on them, that they're so corrupt that they're not actually following through on their international communist duty, which is why Bill Clinton would not hand Europe over to Boris Yeltsin in 1999. It's why Biden would not commit suicide to cause Ukraine to collapse. Biden did not really help Ukraine that much. As General Kellogg, Trump's appointee to these talks, General Kellogg rebuked an interviewer from Radio Liberty saying that the Biden administration has not helped Ukraine. 31 tanks is a token. A handful of fighters, F-16s is a token. A handful of HIMARS is a token. The United States cut Ukraine off completely for 5 whole months. So, and Biden didn't do anything. The first month and a half, almost 2 months of the Ukraine war, Biden didn't lift a finger for Ukraine. He was watching to see if the Russians could win the victory. Once Russia didn't win the victory and the atrocities were known, the pressure was overwhelming to help the underdog, help Ukraine. So, General Kellogg is right on with this, and I think Trump is really going to threaten to help Ukraine to force the Russians to the table. And to answer your earlier question, the reason that one of the reasons for this meeting, the Russians pretended. Mr. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, in the middle of December said, "Oh no, look at Vladimir Putin's statement in June at the foreign ministry, and it's basically a statement of unconditional surrender. We want Ukraine basically to surrender. It's a very elaborate way of surrendering Ukraine." And of course, that's why Ukraine won't negotiate. The Russians are demanding effectively denazification, which means surrender, because Ukraine's not Nazi. They have a Jewish president. It's absurd. It just means that they wipe out all the leaders and replace them with their own puppets, and they annex huge sections of it. But now Putin is going to meet with Trump. Why? Because Russia's economy is crumbling. Their officer corps is very upset that the war is continuing because they're losing too many men. Russia needs a break in the war. They need to refit in order to come back and do it right. And this is what they're hoping to get from Trump.
What about the Congress has appropriated what billions, if not tens of billions of dollars to help, allegedly to help the Ukraine in the war. What happened to that money?
I think we lost more weapons at Afghanistan than we've given to Ukraine, to be honest.
Okay.
You do, most of the money given to Ukraine is humanitarian help for people who are starving and don't have enough to get by. After all, the country is so wrecked. They've bombed so many apartments and gas stations and supermarkets and residences that a lot of the people there are homeless. They don't have enough energy to stay warm in the winter. Ukraine needs this help. As far as the weapons, Europe is sending, it was the Great Britain and Germany and the Scandinavian countries. The ones that have the biggest per capita commitment are the Baltic states, the Scandinavian countries, and Poland, not the United States. The United States is just a much bigger country. And so when we give a pittance, it amounts to a lot more. But earlier a year ago, we had cut them completely off for 5 months. Look, this is a 3-year war. You know how expensive wars are? I mean, to send them, what, 100, what do we send them? 70, 80 billion the first year of the war? Maybe 70, 80 billion the second year. This is nothing. This is peanuts. This isn't 1% of our gross national product. Our government spends, what, 3, 4 trillion dollars a year? 70 billion. I mean, it's nothing. It's not even a penny on the dollar that we're spending for them. And it's a shield for Europe because Europe's not ready. If Ukraine was not there, these Russian armies were in Europe, NATO could not put up an army as big as Ukraine's to hold back the Russians. And the Russians, by the way, can't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine because they're their brother Slavs. They're their brother. They claim that it's Russian territory, that they're Russians there, that they're rescuing. They can't use nuclear weapons. They get to NATO, though, they can use nukes. And they've got more nukes than we do, and they're more ready for nuclear war than we do. So then we're at a really serious disadvantage. And that's what people here haven't reckoned on. They really haven't.
Let me ask you something. I remember when the Congress passed an aid package for the war in the Ukraine, and I saw the entire Democrat side of the House. I mean, it was supported by both Republicans and Democrats, but I saw Nancy Pelosi and the other Democrats, they were standing up after this legislation passed with a big smile. And I asked myself, why are they smiling, and what don't I understand about? I do not trust them. If they're for something, it immediately leads me to think there must be something fishy here. So what it,
Well, these people, their whole careers, what side did they support in the Cold War?
well,
China and Russia.
yeah,
Look at they were supporting the Uranium One deal. Look at Obama. Look at what he did. Look at
right,
what Biden did. They were supporting Russia. They
okay,
were supporting Russia, and when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and in the initial stages of the invasion
right.
and they annexed Crimea, what did Obama do? Nothing. Really, nothing that mattered. Nothing was done. And did Obama give weapons to Ukraine? No. It was Trump was the first president to give weapons to Ukraine.
Okay, so you're
So
saying this is their chance to show that they are strong military defenders.
yeah, well, think of the word alibi.
Alibi.
If you have been helping our country's enemies your whole career and your
Right.
country's enemies are starting to advance, the one thing you do not want to do at that moment, you're really scared, is to appear to be on the same side as those enemies. You were helping Russia and China as long as they weren't overt enemies. The minute they're overt enemies, you can hear Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying to Hillary Clinton at a secret meeting in back in 2012, look, Hillary, you got to pretend to be our enemy now because we don't want you to get hurt. We need all our friends in America to stay in power. If you are with us when we do these things, you're going to be thrown out of power. So you need to have an alibi. You need to pretend to be, and you need to be our enemies first. And you have to accuse the Republicans of being Russia's friend. And what did they do in the 2016 election? Hillary Clinton accused Trump of being a Russian puppet, of being a Russian agent. And
Right.
that whole Russia, Russia, Russia thing was accusing Trump. And why were they doing it? Again, it's an alibi.
Right.
They want to, and then what did they do? The Russians then infiltrate the Republican Party, the MAGA movement, and they get these knuckleheads like Tucker Carlson to repeat Russian propaganda lies and to interview numbskulls like Douglas McGregor, that colonel that he's always talking to, who said in the 10th day of the war that Ukraine was finished. Ukraine lost the war on day 10. It's going to be over in 10 days. 3 years later, the war's still going. Douglas McGregor has egg over his face, but he has no shame. He's not beat red from shame. He's out there saying, "Oh, Ukraine is doomed. Ukraine is doomed. Russia's won the war." After 3 years, come on, we're tired of hearing these lies, these Russian lies. You're trying to demoralize us. And the same thing with Scott Ritter, the convicted child molester. Look, these people are not to be trusted, right? You're an arms control inspector from Russia, and you come back with a Russian wife. Come on, look, you got to know who the agents of influence look to be. I mean, you can dupe people, you can use agents of influence, you can get them to spread propaganda, but we got to remember, know who your friends are and know who your enemies are. China and Russia are like this. They're enemies, they're armed, their missiles are pointed at the US of A. They're ready to attack Japan, South Korea, NATO, and the US. Do you know that Chinese bombers, this is what General Van Herk told me, Chinese bombers are based now in Russia. Did you know that? Chinese strategic bombers are based in Russia, in Siberia, and they're flying with Russian aircraft right up into our airspace in Alaska. They've been doing that for months. It's been in the newspapers. They're our enemy. They're doing it to South Korea. They're doing it to Japan. Their warships are doing joint exercises. You think this is just an accident? No, it's not. It's all part of a design. And the propaganda is to disorient and confuse us as to who our enemies are. Now we just don't have useful idiots on the left. We've got them on the right as well, both in Europe and the US. Look at the AfD party. Their lesbian leader is climbed into bed with the Chinese, and she's pro-Russian. And she's supposedly a German patriot. This is just rotten to the core. Look at Macron, and then look at his opposition. They've infiltrated both sides of the political spectrum in all these countries. This is the problem we have. Trump, maybe because he has instincts, is maybe going to be able to break free of that. Maybe we can get a defense here. Maybe.
Okay, so as we wrap up the interview, what advice do you have for the Trump administration?
Don't let Russia off the hook. Russia is in a very bad position. Grind them. Make them give up their positions in Ukraine. Put their economy on tether hooks. Make them expose their alliance with China and what they're doing. Cut them off at the knees. Don't allow them to get all this money from exporting energy. Make us load up these big ships with natural gas. Use this method of shipping natural gas by sea. Cut the Russians out of the energy market. Let's America be the big energy supplier. Let's get the pipelines going for us and cut them off so that maybe there will be a genuine revolution in Russia. Maybe Russia will have a true democracy and the Russian people will be free at some point. Certainly the Ukrainian people deserve to be free. They've been fighting and dying for their freedom for years now. So let's because you know what? The fact is that we're fighting these huge totalitarian powers with nuclear weapons, and the freedom of other people does matter to our freedom, because if they lose our freedom, they're coming for us next. If those people lose their freedom. So that's why America is the kingpin of defense of all the free nations. And we've got to protect freedom and stand up for it. And we've got to oppose the subversives and enemies from within, both on the right and the left in the U.S.
Okay, well, with those parting words, I want to urge all of our audience to go to jrnyquist.blog, and you can read this essay and many others. Thank you for
And
coming
don't
on.
forget my book, The Fool and His Enemy, on Amazon.
Okay, I'm sorry. Say the name of that book.
The Fool and His Enemy at Amazon. You
The
can order
Fool
that book.
and His Enemy
Yeah,
at
at
Amazon. Okay.
Amazon.com. Yes.
All right.
Great book.
All right. Thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.